Assassin's Creed. Well, the franchise is well known to embed the story of their protagonists in real history, and Valhalla is of course no exception to that. My name is Chris, Pixel Psychologist. Let's take a look at the real historical context of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, mixed with some completely random facts. Now, personally, I've always been extremely interested in the Viking Age, the Norse mythology and everything that comes with it. Maybe it's because I can sort of sense a connection there. I'm Russian. And, well, essentially the history of my people starts when Rurik, or rather Rörik, and his Vikings sailed over from Sweden. Now, they stayed. We asked them to help organize our clans and villages, which they were happy to do. So, as a result, we proclaimed Rurik our first monarch. We had similar gods to begin with, similar values, and a similar idea of fun, I suppose. So, we got along. But not everybody saw the Vikings as cheerful drinking buddies. On the contrary. Vikinger. Ruthless, bloodthirsty barbarians. Filthy savages set on raiding, pillaging, plundering, killing, enslaving, making human sacrifices to their wicked heathen gods. Well, that was of course the Christian perception of the Norse warriors, the seafaring Drengir, who started to arrive in Central Europe and on the Anglo-Saxon islands at the end of the 8th century. While Europe as a whole was weakened and struggling through the so-called Dark Ages, let's take a look at the land that was never invaded by the Romans. That's present-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Let's see what's going on. At that time, Scandinavia basically consists of settlements and villages all over. If you believe that the climate is exceptionally harsh and that people aren't really used to anything but ice and snow, well, that's a pretty common misconception. Yeah, they have ice and snow, of course, but you'll find the coldest temperatures right at the border of Norway and Sweden, so right in the middle of the landmass. The northern part of Norway, despite being exposed to the sea and being so much closer to the North Pole, isn't quite as cold as you might expect, and that is thanks to the Gulf Stream. So we've got the currents that flow up there quite nicely and keep the region absolutely habitable. And the south, we've got Denmark. Denmark's pretty mild altogether. So as a reference, on the same latitude, we've got cities like Edinburgh in Scotland, or Moscow, Russia, or Quebec in Canada. In other words, Scandinavia's geography is diverse. Naturally, more people had settled in areas of milder conditions and along the coast, where their agriculture and economy had the best potential to thrive. Imagine those settlements as communities of people who own cattle, pigs, poultry, goats. They tend the land and grow crops, harvest, fish, nothing out of the ordinary. Crafts like woodworking and metalworking are well developed. Scandinavian smiths work their magic mostly with iron, copper and silver. They smelted iron and carbon to get a much more durable alloy, steel. And just like in the game, carbon was indeed quite rare and was therefore used sparingly, for example to coat the edges of a blade to keep it nice and sharp.
It has a blunted blade, but it swings well. Can you sharpen it?
I can give it a better edge and reinforced the handle. And as luck would have it, I have one ingot left for the job.
You may have come across a weapon called the Iron Star. Now, that's a flail. So essentially you've got a spiked ball attached to a heavy chain which is welded into a shaft that you grip and you deal damage. Now, that weapon did indeed exist. However, archaeological findings place it in the 11th century, which is essentially 2 centuries after the timeline of the game. Also, the flail seems to have had its origins not in Scandinavia at all, rather than in Arabia. So it got imported and became relatively well used and widespread in 14th century Germany, where it was given the loving name of Morgenstern, morning star. I shall flail you with my morning star. Kind of poetic if you think about it. Architecture does not simply serve a structural purpose. It often features carved ornaments and depictions of the Norse pantheon, of mythical creatures and mystic elements like runic inscriptions. But let's go back to the people of those settlements. Imagine them as big extended families, and the personal freedom of every single member of every clan was held in high regard. Now, since this is a general overview and not an ancient history lesson, which I would love to do because I'm actually an archaeologist, but I'm not going to do that, I'm going to keep this accordingly short. The one thing that sets the Norse class system apart from other European ones is that certain mechanisms were in place that allowed a person to move from one class to another. And those classes were the rulers, the free, and the unfree.
17 winters? 18?
The lowest in the social order of the Norse were the slaves. A male slave was called a thrall, a female ambat. Slaves were either brought back from Viking raids or bought or made that way through crimes that they had committed. The broadest class were the carls or the bondi, free people with the right to hold land. And that could be literally anything. That could be farmers, warriors, craftsmen, sailors, traders, raiders, and whatever else you can think of, really. That was essentially the middle class. At the upper level of the Norse society, there were the nobles, the jarls, well-respected, wealthy leaders. Though it was common to pass the title of a jarl to the eldest son, that position was not necessarily hereditary. One could be appointed jarl after gaining victories and reputation. A jarl's job was to uphold security and honor of a clan and ensure the safety of every single member. It would also be a jarl who would take command of a ship to go on Viking raids. Several centuries prior to the raiding and pillaging, the Scandinavians were actually known to be peaceful and respectful traders, and not only to nearby countries. They had swift ships and they knew how to use them well, and they sailed all over the continent. In fact, they also were the first ones to discover the continent of North America. The Scandinavians' most common sea trade routes led, of course, to the Anglo-Saxon islands, the German and French coasts, and through the big land inhabited by the Slavic people, which they called Rusland. Via the Volga River, they reached the Caspian Sea, and via the Dnieper, they discovered the Black Sea and Miklagard, literally big stronghold. They've clearly been around.
Through Rusland we barreled down the Volga River, raiding as we went, shadowy tribes hurling spears at our ship. At Miklagard, we saw men bedecked in riches as vibrant as the Bifrost itself. These we took for our troubles, of course.
But let's look at how trading turned into raiding. Well, since written records were more than scarce at that time throughout the entire continent, there is of course no definitive answer to that question, and there will have been several reasons. The most common assumption is that overpopulation and a lack of good farmland were becoming a real issue. Disputes among neighboring settlements would escalate and result in clans fighting one another. In other words, political instability was a thing. Through overseas trades and word of mouth, Norway was aware of the fact that there was indeed wealth in Europe, in both land and silver. So all the Drengir had to do really was pack up and go a Viking.
Put some muscle into those bulls!
Add to that the inspiring and poetic notion of seeking adventures on distant shores, fight for glory or Valhalla and feel closer to the gods. I mean, what's not to like?
Oh, gods. I hate long speeches.
Only when you're not giving them.
Early on, AC Valhalla introduces Harald, a young nobleman who travels to Rygjafylke in Hordafylke and seeks to unite the Jarls and build the greatest army under his own banner.
I dream of something greater. A vast kingdom of warriors in numbers the world has never seen. United under one king, one rule.
Harald Fairhair, as he is known to our history books, was indeed the first king who brought along the unification of Norway.
What? What in hell's name are you doing, father?
So, Sigurd, Eivor, and a substantial chunk of their settlement, Fornborg, are given a choice. Either to accept the impending political change,
It is natural to fear change, to resist it. But all things change and all things end.
Or simply leave the country. Except, of course...
We cannot stay in Norway. Not under Harald's boot. Not without fueling more war. So we push forward to newer lands.
There is no choice, and we leave for the British Isles anyway. Now, a more recent publication by a Norwegian historian suggests another theory. Sure, the Vikings were considered savage and filthy, which, by the way, is complete nonsense. While the Europeans were literally scraping off the dirt of their bodies, bathing maybe once a year or on special occasions like their own marriage, the so-called barbarians, the Scandinavians, had a day in the week designated for bathing. Sauna and everything dates back to those days. But that's completely beside the point. Take a look at the atrocities committed in the name of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. If you went against the doctrines of the Church, you would be sure to lose your head, and quickly, if you were lucky. A quick and painless death was considered a mercy. Otherwise, you would be burned, quartered, fastened to the breaking wheel, and all sorts of slow and drawn-out methods. The idea was to break the physical body so that the soul would have a chance at salvation in order to enter heaven. I'm glad that's evolved. The expansion of the church was aggressive, so it came as no surprise that the Vikings swooped down on monasteries in the first place. It was a direct response to the threat that was the Frankian king, Charles the Great, and the Roman Catholic Church, to the defenses that the Danes had built at their southern border. There was constant fighting going on, but the Danes held their ground. As the balance of power shifted in the late 700s and the reign of Charles the Great was in decline, that is essentially when the Scandinavians manned up, armed up, boarded their ships, and fought back full on as Vikings. I hope you found this little bit of context interesting, informative, useful, and if you did, please let me know by hitting the like button and dropping me a line. Also, if you feel like there's a topic that you would love to know more about, and don't hesitate to get really specific, because specific just means that I'm gonna get to dig deeper into scientific papers and research, and I love to do that. Let me know. Write it in the comments and I'll see if I can weave that into a future video. And that's about it, really. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.